I'm going to talk tonight about mental states of persons and their brains. A slightly different topic, slightly different title from the advertised one, but I think this is a more exact representation of what I want to say. I'm going to start with the question, does the brain think? Or more generally, does the brain represent the world? This is a question which some of you will think has an obvious answer. And for some people the answer is obviously yes, and for some the answer is obviously no. The yes answer, I think, comes from those who say, well, the idea that the brain represents the world is part of the orthodox ideology or assumption of cognitive science or cognitive neuroscience. Those who say no tend to either say no, it could represent the world but it just doesn't, or they say this is a totally confused question. So anyone who attended Peter Hacker's talk here in this series will have heard him say those things in his dialogue. So on the yes side of things, I'll just give you one example, and this is an example from Chris Frith's very nice book, Making Up the Mind, or whatever it's called. If you look at this picture, known as the domino illusion, you can see that there are these apparently concave circles here and concave circles here and convex ones here. The very same picture turned upside down, that's exactly the same image, reveals the concavity and the convexity reversed. Why is that? Why does it look like that? Well, here's what Frith says in his book. That the light of the sun comes from above. This means that concave objects will be dark at the top and light at the bottom, while convex objects will be light at the top and dark at the bottom. Our brain has a simple rule built into its wiring. It uses this rule to decide whether an object is concave or convex. So there's an idea that the brain has a rule built into it. It uses a rule, it makes decisions, it represents things. And books like Chris Frith's and are full of language like this. I just use this as an example. On the other hand, as you will know from having heard Peter Hacker talk in this RIP series, some people think that this is a mistake. Some people think it's a mistake, and they don't just say it's a mistake, they say it's a fallacy. A fallacy is a particular kind of mistake. You'll find that when Peter Hacker talks about things, he often says that things are fallacies when he means that they're mistakes. Or he says that things are confused when he means that they're mistaken. In this case, he thinks there is an actual fallacy of saying that the brain thinks, and it's the fallacy that he calls the mereological fallacy, the mistake of ascribing to the constituent parts of an animal attributes that logically apply only to the whole animal. And this is the what he calls the mereological fallacy. Mereology, of course, being the study of parts and wholes. As I'm sure you know, that Wittgenstein said things which have been taken in this way himself. Wittgenstein said, only of a human being and what resembles, behaves like a living human being, can one say it has sensation, it sees, is blind, hears, is deaf, is conscious or unconscious. And I think Peter Hacker's various statements of his attacks on the representation of the world by the brain are sort of improvisations around that particular theme from Wittgenstein. So what resembles a human being, what looks like it, what behaves like it, only of those things you can say that it has sensations and so on. So here's a brain, picture of a brain. As you can see, it doesn't resemble a living, breathing human being or thinker. It doesn't even resemble something that resembles a living human being or thinker. I don't know whether this counts as something of which you can say that it has thoughts by Wittgenstein's test, but at least it resembles something that has thoughts on Wittgenstein's view. So, as I said, Hacker thinks that this is not just a mistake, actually. He says it's a mistake, but he thinks it's a confusion. So confusion is a particular kind of mistake. It's not somehow empirically false or straightforwardly false that the brain represents the world. It's confused. Because it's a conceptual truth, he says, that perception, thoughts and feelings are attributes of human beings, not of their parts, in particular, not of their brains. So there's supposed to be a fallacy here, but the fallacy doesn't seem to derive from any general rule or prohibition or conceptual principle that says you can only attribute things to the whole of the system, and you can't attribute things to the part of the system that you would also attribute to the whole. There are many cases where you can attribute properties to parts of things which you can also attribute to the whole of the things. So it's got to be something to do with the use of the word thought or sensation or consciousness or thinking or deciding or one of these things. Now I think that what this attribution of conceptual confusion ignores is the lesson that philosophers should have learned, one of the lessons they should have learned from Wittgenstein. Ironically, I think, and this point is purely and gratuitously ad hominem, that Wittgenstein's own remarks here show what's wrong with Peter Hacker's way of thinking of this. Think about the concept of a picture for a minute. There's a picture of Humphrey Bogart. And here's a picture too. This is a famous picture by Jackson Pollock. I'd like here to quote a very nice discussion of the concept of a picture in some recent work by Stephen Mulhall. It's unpublished work, but it's about to be published. Where Stephen Mulhall says, he's talking about what he calls the projectability of language. He said the word picture denotes, among other things, abstract paintings, representational paintings and films, i.e. motion pictures. Although abstract paintings and films each have something in common with representational paintings, there seem to be no relevant features common to a Jackson Pollock drip painting and a projected image of Humphrey Bogart. And yet we have no inclination, do we, to say that the word has one meaning in a conversation about Casablanca and another when the talk turns to Lavender Mist, which is the name of that painting by Pollock. And I think this seems to me exactly right. There's no reason to say that the word picture has a different meaning in these two cases. Mulhall goes on, he says, if someone were to construct such a pattern of use from scratch, we might find it rather puzzling. But if we see it as a result of a process of historical development, the puzzle dissolves. In the case of picture, the original focus on representational painting naturally licenses an extension of the term's use to photographs and thence to motion pictures. And developments in painting also made natural a different extension of the term to include canvases of a non-representational sort. So you see how the word develops across time. It has this characteristic that Mulhall calls projectability. I think this is a good description of the way we find it so natural to move on using words beyond perhaps their original context. So for example, we could ask the question, can people fly? Of course people can't fly. Superman, he still can't fly. What is it to fly? Well, to propel yourself through the air, maybe using some wings or some other kind of device or something along those lines. Maybe that's what it is to fly. But actually, no, I'm telling you, I'm flying to Turin in 2 weeks' time. I'm going to give a lecture there. Think of it in that way. Can people fly? You can travel in an aeroplane. That's flying. Did you fly here or did you come by train? It would be a very, very pedantic person who said, no, you can't have flown here because to fly is to propel yourself through the air using wings or something. That would be pedantry of the most pointless kind and missing the point. Or a very bad joke or something like that. So these rather simple points, I think, about what we might call the projectability of language and meaning and the interrelatedness of meaning I think, allow us to say that maybe it's not such a confused thing to say that the brain thinks something or that the brain represents something. Maybe there isn't any simple mereological fallacy here. In fact, I say this is what we should have learnt from Wittgenstein. When Wittgenstein says, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances, for various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, colour of eyes, gait, temperament, and so on and so forth, overlap and crisscross in the same way. And I shall say games form a family. That's when he's talking about the word game. Now, of course, I'm not here endorsing any particular Wittgensteinian thesis about a language, except this point, that if we are going to talk about what it does or does not make sense to say, we should actually look at what it does or does not make sense to say. It makes perfect sense to say that people fly. It makes perfect sense to say that that the Jackson Pollock painting is a picture, just as the photograph is a picture. These things make sense. In the same way, I propose we should say it does make sense. We know in a way what's going on when someone says that the brain thinks something. We know in a way. Dennett comments on this discussion of hackers that it's not a fallacy. There isn't a mereological fallacy here. And he says, we don't attribute fully fledged beliefs to the brain parts. That would be a fallacy, he said. I'm not so sure about that, but he says, but we attribute an attenuated sort of belief to these parts, stripped of many of their everyday connotations. Just as a young child can sort of believe that her daddy is a doctor without full comprehension of what a daddy or a doctor is, so a robot or some part of a person's brain can sort of believe that there is an open door a few feet ahead. So says Dennett. And then he goes on to say that far from being a mistake to attribute hemi, semi, demi, proto, quasi, pseudo intentionality to the mereological parts of persons, it is precisely the enabling move that lets us see how on earth to get the whole wonderful persons out of brute mechanical parts. I don't know so much about wonderful persons. I mean, if you start with brute mechanical parts, you might end up with a brute mechanical person. But what he's alluding to here is a distinction which he made famous in his book from many decades ago, which is the book Content and Consciousness, which is a distinction between persons and parts of persons, a personal, subpersonal distinction, which, as it's become known. And Dennett introduces this in the context of a discussion of pain. Nothing's going to turn on whether we're talking about the mental state of pain or mental state of thinking here. So this was Dennett's original example. He said, when we've said that a person has a sensation of pain, that he locates it and is prompted to react in a certain way, we have said all there is to say within the scope of this vocabulary, he says. Since the introduction of unanalyzable mental qualities leads to a premature end to explanation, we may decide that such an introduction is wrong and look for alternative modes of explanation. If we do this, we must abandon the explanatory level of people and their sensations and activities and turn to the subpersonal level of brains and events in the nervous system. So that remark about the hemi, demi, semi, proto-intentionality and how you attribute that to a brain in order to explain how that's built up into the what the person has, what the person does, that is alluding to this old distinction from 40 years before, in his first book, Content and Consciousness. So that's the key part there is the alternative mode of explanation. Personal and subpersonal are two modes of explanation of this system. There's the personal way of explaining things appeals to concepts like sensation and their behavior, location and reaction. And the alternative explanatory level of the subpersonal is brains and events in the nervous system, and that is mechanical and not intentional, according to Dennett. Now, I think this distinction is very important, but there are a number of ways in which it could be taken. Dennett himself points out that the lesson about the subpersonal distinction has occasionally been misconstrued, he said, as the lesson that the personal level of explanation is the only level of explanation when the subject matter is human minds and actions. Now, an extreme kind of reading of Wittgenstein's remark about it's only to a living, breathing human being that you can make these attributions, an extreme reading of that would endorse this claim that the personal level is the only level of explanation when the subject matter is human minds and actions. And I don't think we should endorse that, and Dennett doesn't either, actually. So that just brings us to our question, which remains, which is, what does it mean then? Or when is it true? Under what circumstances is it true that parts of persons have intentional states, or states with intentional content? And that's the question I'm going to answer in the rest of this lecture. I've made some remarks that indicate how I think it's not obviously a fallacy to say that a brain can think, or that a brain can represent, or the brain can want something. It's not obviously meaningless, and in fact, on purely Wittgensteinian grounds, we should accept that such transfers and extensions of meaning are part of the essence of language. But what does it mean? Well, one story about what it means, which goes back to the 1970s, is the idea that representation in the brain is a matter of there literally being symbols written in your brain. That there are symbols which are, represent the contents of your mental states or your subpersonal states, or symbols which represent your beliefs, maybe if it's at the personal level. And these symbols form what's known as a language of thought. This view was defended by Jerry Fodor in a famous book in 1975. Over the years it's been defended by other people. In recent years it's fallen out of popularity somewhat. I put these phrase structure diagrams here just because it was rather hard to find a picture on the internet of the language of thought, which is not only because it doesn't exist, because there are lots of things that do exist that you can't find pictures of on the internet, but this is inspired by, the common cause of the language of thought hypothesis and transformational grammar is Chomsky. So Chomsky is in some ways an inspiration for the Fodorian idea of a system of mental representation in your brain. Now, I said this doesn't exist, so I've jumped the gun a bit there. The language of thought doesn't exist. There's no such thing. There actually is no such thing as the language of thought. And what's more, no one really thinks there is such a thing. They hypothesize that there might be such a thing just for the sake of argument. They'll say, suppose for the sake of argument there's a language of thought. But there isn't such a thing. There's a nice comment about this from Francis Egan, a colleague of Fodor's actually at Rutgers University, who isn't green. I think this projector shows red as green, so Francis Egan doesn't have a green face. In a really nice interview with Professor Egan on that 3 AM website, she discusses her views about mental representation. And she gives a really clear exposition of this. And when she talks about the language of thought, she says there isn't much empirical support for this view. It's a very elegant picture, but it's not likely to be the way that minds develop naturally as a product of evolution in fits and starts. So I'm just going to put this view to one side. It's an extreme that we could consider, because as it were, it's at the other extreme from thinking that it's just conceptual confusion to think that there could be representations in the brain. This extreme says there can't be, I mean, Fodor would say there can't really be beliefs unless there are representations in the brain. But I don't think this view's got anything going for it, so I think we should move on. there's another way of looking at it. Instead of thinking in terms of the representation in the brain as being written in a language, we can think instead of what it is that people are doing when they attribute representations to the brain, when they say things like the brain knows that light comes from above. What is it that the attributors of intentional states are actually doing in this case? So the interpreter is the theorist, the neuroscientists say, who's trying to understand what is the best explanatory structure to account for how the brain moves from one state to the next. And I think the best way to think of what they're doing when they do that, when they attribute, say, if they attribute a representation of the distance between the ears to the brain in order to calculate where objects are located, the best way to think of that is to think there's a system. The system is the brain. And what you're trying to do is to explain the system's behavior. What you're trying to do is to explain why the system moves from one state to another. And there are these states of the system which then you can map onto what I'm going to call contents. So the content might be something like the rule that, if the light's coming from above, then this is if the shadow falls from above, then this is a convex object, for example. And these rules are what I'm going to call the contents, and the contents are just, as I say, related to the intrinsic or non-intrinsic states of the system by a mapping. That is to say, a mapping is just a correlation that the theorist comes up with. And this is what I'm going to call a model, that the content is a model of the state of the system. Now, I mean, by model there, I don't mean what model means in logic. I mean what it means in science and in the philosophy of science. For example, a simple example that I learned at school was the solar system as modeled, the solar system model of an atom. You have the nucleus with the electrons spinning around, and the nucleus is made of protons and neutrons, and they orbit it like the solar system. That's a model of the atom, it's not supposed to be a picture of what the atom looked like, but if you could get down there and get small enough and get down on in there with the atom, that's what it would look like. That's not the idea. The idea is that it's a picture, an image, or an abstract representation which corresponds to some features of the system which is being modelled. It abstracts away from a lot of the detail of the actual system, and in doing that, it tries to make certain aspects of the system salient. So I say it's not surprising that cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, employs models. And I said that the model of, say, for example, here the model I'm thinking of as the intentional content, the representational content. It's not surprising that they employ models, since models are essential to science in any case. So the biggest, as I understand philosophy of science, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but as I understand it, the biggest change in the philosophy of science in the last 40, 50 years has been the move from what people call the syntactic view of theories, the syntactic view, where you think of a theory as a bunch of sentences, and you think there are deductive relations between sentences. So the paradigm of this, if anyone's familiar with Hempel's book, in philosophy of natural science, that explanation is a kind of deduction between sentences from laws and statements listing the initial conditions, and you explain a phenomenon by deducing a statement about it. And there the idea was that theories are essentially, they have a linguistic structure. This is called the syntactic view of theories. I don't quite understand this terminology myself, but I suppose it's because the idea is that a theory is a bunch of sentences and a sentence is a syntactic object. Whereas the view that theories are models, I think was called by Van Fraassen the semantic view of theories. That's not a very good term either, but that's what it's called. The semantic view of theories says that what a scientific theory is a bunch of models. And this is a completely radical change in the conception of what theories are. And when you apply this to the case of the understanding of the brain, then you can see that what goes on in neuroscience, when neuroscience talks about the brain representing things or the brain wanting things or deciding things, what they're doing is just modeling states of the system by relating those states to certain abstract objects. But that seems to me, so that the general picture, I think, of what's going on in talk about the brain representing things is just that you use sentences to model the states of the system. So going back to Chris Frith's example, the rule here, the brain has this simple rule built into its wiring. It uses this rule to decide whether an object is concave or convex. The rule is that concave objects will be dark at the top and light at the bottom. Convex objects will be light at the top and dark at the bottom. That doesn't mean that those words are written in the brain, but those words are written in English or any other language, or even in brainese, mentalese as Fodor called it. Those words are not in the brain. What they are is that it's an abstraction away from the activity of the brain in a way that, that can help you with predicting and explaining what's going on. That's the thought, then, that the process in the brain is understood by modelling it with a rule relating shading to convexity and concavity. So in other cases too, like in the Canister Triangle, where you see this, everybody sees this white triangle as occluding parts of these black circles, and that this is completed by, so to speak, this is what they talk about it being completed in the visual system by making certain assumptions about objects and how they relate to one another. Now, one question about this is whether this is just, so to speak, a natural regularity that the brain does these things, or whether the brain actually should be conceived of as making an inference, and that's a good question. If you think of it as making an inference, then you are, this is a more complex model. You think the brain is inferring one thing to another, or rather you represent the states of the brain as if they can be treated as inferring these things. So the level to which the model is complexified is a theoretical question, and a question for different models will be appropriate for different systems of complexity. Now, when I talk about models here, I'm talking about models in the sense of the philosophy of science, and many things come under that heading. So drawings, pictures, abstractions, ideas of things that actually don't exist in reality, perfect shapes, frictionless planes, and things like this. These are ways of idealizing away from the messy reality to get to empirical conclusions. And there are many things. One of the good things about the notion of a model, as I understand it, is that it's extremely flexible and open, and it doesn't mean just one thing. However, there's one question which I will draw attention to and not answer, which is whether models are real. And I don't mean by that whether the things that are modelled are real, whether brains are real, or whether the solar system is, whether the atom is real. I don't mean that. I mean, what about the reality of the model itself? Is and in our case, this is particularly, this is something that's been discussed by many thinkers, which is the reality of intentional content. So is the content of a brain state, is that something real? Well, there's a line of argument that said that these contents are rather like abstract things, they're abstract entities. Abstract entities, then people debate about whether they're real or unreal. For example, the debate that goes on from time to time about whether meanings exist, whether meanings are real, or whether propositions exist. You don't need to take any stand on this to believe in models, it seems to me. You don't have to believe any more than you have to believe that the solar system model of an atom exists. It's a construction, it's an artifact. You could think it's a real thing, or you could think it's a creation, or you could think, and here there's been really interesting work done on this by Roman Frigg at the LSE, you could try and understand models by a rather strict analogy with fiction. So you think of models as kind of fictional constructions. And this would be a good way to go in the case of meanings and propositions. You could think that meanings and propositions are in a sense things that we make up. On this view, they're kind of fictions that we use to understand the behavior of concrete objects. So that, in very simple terms, is what I mean by saying that, that the brain represents things. But what about the person? I've been talking about the subpersonal level, and what should we conclude about the personal level? So does the same apply, that is the whole modelling picture, does the same apply to the states of the whole person, e.g. the beliefs, desires, and other propositional attitudes? The propositional attitudes, this was Russell's term for those states of mind which represent the world as being true or false in some way or another, where you can think of their content as being true or false. So beliefs are the paradigm of the propositional attitude in Russell's sense. So some people would think, well, it's all very well to go on about the subpersonal level, and you can say at the subpersonal level there isn't really any real representing going on, and it's just this all this talk that it's just a way of talking, as you've worked it out. But surely that can't be true of our beliefs. Surely the same isn't true of beliefs. Beliefs must be real if anything is, if any of the mind is real. So I want to reject that. I want to say that actually it's the same sort of thing is going on with the propositional attitudes. And here I want to remind you or tell you of two influential views about the propositional attitudes. Propositional attitudes being states like beliefs, where you can say that someone believes that something is the case. Two influential views over the years have been that the concept of intentionality, the mind's representation of the world, the mind's direction upon its objects, should be understood in terms of the propositional attitudes. This is a thesis that's been held by many people, Donald Davidson and many others. And the other thesis is that the propositional attitude should be thought of as relations to propositions. So that a propositional attitude, like believing that the sun is shining, is a relation between the person and the thing believed, namely the proposition that the sun is shining. And that was the way Russell put it. He said that these propositional attitudes are relations to they're attitudes to a proposition. An attitude is a certain kind of relation to a proposition. So when you believe that the sun is shining, you have one kind of relation to it, and when you hope that the sun is shining, you stand in another kind of relation to it. Now this for a long time has been a dogma of analytical philosophy of mind. Fodor again is a big figure in this area. Fodor says propositional attitudes should be analysed as relations. Beliefs, he believes, looks like a two-place relation, so it relates two things, the thinker and the proposition. It would be nice if our theory of belief permitted us to save the appearances, Fodor said. And in a famous paper by Hartree Field, he said a similar thing. Propositional attitude attributions appear to relate people to non-linguistic entities called propositions. And then he says that's a problem for materialists. So the picture is that a bit like when you have when you represent things. If there was a blackboard here, I'd draw it to represent someone that's having a speech bubble or think bubble. I was looking for a think bubble, but on the way I found one of my favourite cartoons. So it's just which has nothing to do with this talk. Someone's saying here, "Are you coming to bed?" I can't. This is important. What? Someone is wrong on the internet. So this person here thinks someone is wrong on the internet. This is the proposition that they think. This is relation to them. It's a proposition and related to them. It's not a very good diagram. I just wanted to advertise that XKCD cartoon reproduced without permission. So that's the picture of a relation to a proposition. You've got this proposition, the thing you think, and you've got your belief, and that's a relation to it. And I want to say, what does that mean? What does it even mean? What sort of sense does that make, that you're related to a proposition by the relation of believing? If that's just not another way of saying that you believe it. What's the point of saying you're related to a proposition? I think we can make sense of it, so long as we think of it as a model. The proposition is a model of an aspect of your state of mind. So the picture I want to reject, and here I don't have an argument against this picture, I'm just inviting you as sensible, reasonable people just to agree with me that this cannot be a basic psychological fact that people are related to propositions. That simply cannot be a basic psychological fact. It's a way of talking. It's a way of talking. When we say that someone believes that that I can't think of an example, but someone believes that P, some proposition P, right? And someone thinks that. What we're doing is we're relating their state of mind, their whole psychological outlook, we're picking out a feature of it by relating it to this abstract object, the proposition. The proposition is not an object for investigation, it's an object of stipulation. It's something that we make up. You have found in the early part of the 20th century there was an enormous amount of philosophizing about the nature of the proposition. But that wasn't because people like Russell and Moore and people who discussed the nature of the proposition, not because they thought there were these things, well, I mean, they did talk in this way, as if there were these things which we're trying to investigate. But more charitably, they should be thought of as thinking, what kind of abstract objects are best used to model mental states? And that kind of thing goes on today in the disputes between different theories of propositions. Different theories of propositions where people say that propositions, some people think that the constituents of propositions are objects on the properties on the one hand, and some people say no, they're not objects and properties, the constituents of propositions are sensors or something conceptual or something like that. And then some people say that a proposition is a set of possible worlds. And when I first heard that, I didn't know whether I was still talking to people who spoke English. A proposition is a set of possible worlds. What can that possibly mean? Well, it does mean something, but what it shouldn't mean is the idea that somehow the investigation for the philosophy of mind and the study of the mind in general should be to investigate the relationship between people and sets of possible worlds. That's completely the wrong way around. The right way around is that people have thoughts. There are things going on in their minds, and we represent these thoughts by relating them to these abstract objects that we stipulate and describe in various ways. So in that sense, there isn't a fact of the matter about whether someone believes a certain proposition considered as this set of possible worlds or that set of possible worlds. It's rather whether this set of possible worlds or that one best models their mental state. So I call this, in honour of the semantic conception of theories, and I think that it is the semantic conception of representation. Semantic because it's drawn from the project of semantics, that is to say the systematic representation of the determination of truth values of sentences by assigning objects to the parts of sentences. That's what formal semantics does. You try and show how the truth value of the whole is determined by the semantic properties of the parts. So the semantic properties of mental states, if we want to talk in that way, the idea that a belief might be true or something, is understood in terms of the semantic properties of their contents, and the contents here are the propositions. So I say that for a state to have propositional content is for it to be interpretable as a relation to a proposition. That's what it is for a state to have propositional content. It's not a discovery that it has propositional content, it's an invention of the theorist. And this applies, I want to say, to the subpersonal states, although they are not things, they're not propositional attitudes in the same way, as I said, and the personal states too. But the key idea here is the idea of a model. So, and finally then, there are two kinds of questions, and I think two kinds of dispute about the propositional attitudes and about intentionality, which this approach helps to clear up. And one is the thing I've already mentioned. Well, what kind of proposition is it? What kind of proposition is it that a thinker is related to? Should we think of thinkers as being related to sets of possible worlds? Should we think of the contents of their thoughts as being sets of possible worlds? Now, there are some advantages of thinking of that. For example, we can say that because the sets of possible worlds are very formally very tractable, and you can there are relations of entailment that then can be understood in the set theoretic way for sets of possible worlds. So those who know the Lewis and Stolnacker view will know what I'm talking about. If you haven't come across that view, it's not important for what I'm saying. But there are aspects of the set of possible worlds view which are very bad for representing distinctions between mental states. For example, if a proposition is a set of possible worlds, then a necessarily true proposition is just the set of all possible worlds. Every necessarily true proposition is the same, because every sentence that expresses a necessary truth is true in all the same worlds. So that means that there's only one necessary truth, and there's only one necessary falsehood. Now that is sometimes taken to be a reductio ad absurdum of the view. It's funny when you talk to people who believe this view, you say, well, I don't believe your view because on your view all necessary truths express the same proposition. And they say, yeah, that's the problem of necessary truth. And I say, no, it's not the problem of necessary truth, it's a problem with your theory. But I don't want to say it's a reductio ad absurdum. What I want to show is that it shows that the view that propositions are sets of possible worlds is a partial model of states of mind. It'll be good for some things and not good for others. And similarly, the view that propositions are what they call Russellian propositions, that's a partial model. It'll express the fact that the object of your thought is that very object you're thinking about. That's good. That's good too. But I think here we should agree with this year's Royal Institute of Philosophy annual lecturer, David Chalmers, when he said that we should be a pluralist about representational content. And what he means by that is that there's no such thing as the representational content, say, of an experience. He's talking about experience here. But there are many different contents associated with different content relations. So the first question then about which propositions really are the contents of beliefs, I think we can just, once you realize that propositions are models, then this question just crumbles away. It's not that it's answered, it just ceases to become pressing. The second question then finally is that the question of the precision of the contents of beliefs, and this is something which is a very puzzling thing, that if beliefs were really determinate things, determinate in the sense that there was a real fact of the matter about, say, whether a dog believed that the cat went up the tree. And in Davidson's famous discussion of that, he objects to this on the grounds that to say that the dog believes that the cat goes up the tree requires that the Dog has the concept of a tree, and what does he think? A tree is something living, and the tree has leaves, and the tree's made of wood, and all these things that we believe about trees. How can the dog believe all those things? So you might worry that, how do we actually pin down what the content of a belief really is? So Dennett's example, when the child believes that her father is a doctor, what exactly does she believe? And it's a good question. Now, there's so much one could say about this to do with holism about beliefs and indeterminacy of belief, but I just want to point out that if you think of there not being one sentence that expresses what you believe, you give up on that idea that there are many propositions that could characterize your belief in different ways, and that as you struggle to express your beliefs, what you're trying to do is fix on what is the most appropriate way of expressing what it is you believe. And the model picture helps with that. The language of thought picture doesn't really help with that because it suggests that there is inside your head one sentence that actually fixes once and for all whether the dog believes that the cat went up the tree. Inside the dog's head, I mean. Or fixes once and for all that whether the child believes that the father is a doctor, what does she believe? So I suggest we don't think of it like this, and in fact, returning to a great discussion by Robert Cummings from his Meaning and Mental Representation, where he says this nice thing that attributing a belief is going to be a bit like attributing a point of view to an editorial. You could attribute a point of view to an editorial even if you didn't actually pick out a sentence that was contained in that editorial. So that brings me pretty much to everything I wanted to say for this evening. I just want to finally preempt a possible resistance to this. This is somehow the view I'm describing as some sort of anti-realism or instrumentalism about the mental. And I want to say that's not true. It's not an anti-realism. I'm saying there is a psychological reality there. There is this reality, which is the reality that you're attempting to model by using propositions in these various different ways. And in fact, this modeling conception, just as the modeling conception of the atom is quite compatible with a hard-headed realism about atoms, so the modeling conception of the propositional attitudes is entirely compatible with the reality of consciousness and the psychological. So here's where I'd want to depart from Dennett. Dennett, of course, says he does believe in the reality of consciousness, but he thinks that if you think that you should not think that there's one place in the brain where it all comes together. That's what he called the Cartesian theatre. So I don't see why there should be one place in the brain where it all comes together, but there's one place in our minds where it all comes together, which is how things seem to us in our conscious mental life, in the stream of consciousness. And the reality of that is not, I think, sort of questioned or undermined by the picture that I've sketched tonight about modelling and propositional attitudes. Thank you very much.